Arizona Territory, 1875. The sun hung mercilessly in a cloudless sky, baking the wooden platform that stood alone in the center of the makeshift auction yard. James Blackwood stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he watched the proceedings unfold. At 52, the former Union captain carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen enough of the world to know its cruelties and its rare moments of grace. The auction yard had been hastily constructed on the outskirts of Prescott, a frontier town still finding its footing a decade after the Civil War. Dust devils swirled between the boots of onlookers, most of them ranchers, miners, and traders drawn by curiosity rather than genuine interest in what was being sold. James adjusted the brim of his hat against the glare, his calloused fingers brushing against the gray at his temples. The Colt Navy 1851 hung at his hip, a remnant of his military days, its ivory grip worn smooth from years of use. He had come to town for supplies, not to attend an auction, but something had drawn him here when he heard the whispers in the general store. "Got something special today," a man had said, voice lowered. Crane caught himself an Apache woman, the dangerous kind. Around him now, men spoke in hushed tones of cattle prices, gold claims in California, and the storm that had devastated crops in Kansas. Normal conversation that thinned and died as Silas Crane, a man known for dealing in whatever would turn a profit, climbed onto the platform. "Gentlemen," Crane called out, wiping sweat from his brow with a dirty handkerchief. "A rare opportunity today." James felt his breath catch as two men dragged a woman onto the platform. She was Apache, her black hair falling in braids adorned with beads and feathers, her chin lifted despite the chains that bound her wrists. What caught his attention were the markings on her face painted symbols in red that stood out starkly against her bronze skin. Warrior markings, her eyes fiercer than any James had ever seen, scanned the crowd, not in fear but in assessment. When those eyes briefly met his, James felt something shift inside him, a recognition of a kindred spirit who had seen too much of humanity's darker nature. $3, he would say later, though at that moment he had no idea those words would change everything. In Prescott, James Blackwood was known as a man of few words and reliable judgment. Townsfolk spoke of his skill with a rifle, his knowledge of the territory, and his tendency to disappear into the wilderness for weeks at a time. What they didn't speak of, at least not in his hearing, was the grief that had hollowed him from the inside. 8 months earlier, James had lost his daughter Elizabeth. At 16, she had been the light of his world, a girl with her mother's gentle eyes and a spirit as wild as the territory itself. Since losing his wife Sarah to influenza during the war, James had raised Elizabeth alone, teaching her to ride, hunt, and read the stars. She had grown into a young woman with a fierce intelligence and a belief that the world could be better than it was. "Books can bridge any divide, Papa," she had told him, her arms filled with primers and readers she had collected, "even between people who think they have nothing in common." It was this belief that had led her to the missionary outposts 15 miles south of town, where she volunteered teaching reading to the children of various tribes who came to trade. James had worried but allowed it, unable to deny the passion that lit her face when she spoke of her students. The memory stabbed at him now as he watched the Apache woman on the platform. Elizabeth had died during a border skirmish, caught in crossfire between soldiers and a band of raiders. By the time James arrived, responding to reports of trouble, she was already gone, clutching a child's reader to her chest as though it might shield her. The official report claimed it was an Apache arrow that killed her, but James had seen enough battlefield deaths to recognize a bullet wound. Some young, frightened soldier had fired without identifying his target. The knowledge had nearly broken him. His homestead, 160 acres claimed under the Homestead Act, sat neglected now. The small herd of cattle received minimal care. The vegetable garden had withered, and the books Elizabeth had loved gathered dust. James went through the motions of living without truly living at all. The irony wasn't lost on him that Elizabeth, who had believed so strongly in understanding between peoples, had died because of fear and misunderstanding. She had seen humanity in everyone she met. Standing here now, watching an Apache woman being sold like livestock, James wondered what Elizabeth would say if she could see how quickly her hopes for reconciliation had faded. As Crane began his sales pitch, James found himself studying the Apache woman more closely, noting the dignity in her posture, the intelligence in her eyes, the way she assessed each man in the crowd as a potential threat. She reminded him painfully of Elizabeth. "What we have here," Crane announced, grabbing the woman's arm and pushing her forward, "is a prime specimen. Strong, healthy, and young enough to provide years of service." The woman jerked her arm away from Crane's grasp, her chains rattling with the sudden movement. A murmur ran through the crowd. "Captured near the Sierra Ancha Mountains," Crane continued, unperturbed. "Speaks English, so no need for hand signals. Understands commands." He paused, a sly smile crossing his face. "Though I should warn you, gentlemen, she has a wild streak." James studied her more carefully. She appeared to be around 30, though it was difficult to tell through the warrior markings on her face. Three distinct symbols stood out against her skin. One across her forehead, another on her left cheek, and a third near her jaw. Her clothing was traditional Apache, a deerskin dress adorned with beadwork, now dirty and torn in places from rough handling. "Her name is Nara," Crane said, pronouncing it incorrectly, "though you can call her whatever you like once you own her." The woman, Nara, stared directly at Crane as he spoke, her expression one of controlled fury rather than fear. James had seen that look before, on the faces of captured soldiers who were simply waiting for a chance to escape or fight back. "Bidding starts at $5, Crane announced, looking around expectantly. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. $5 could buy a good horse or a week's worth of supplies. For a woman who looked more likely to slit your throat than cook your dinner, it seemed steep. When no one spoke, Crane frowned. "Fine. $4. Still silence. $3, Crane said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Surely she's worth that much for the work she can do." It was then that Nara spoke, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the desert heat like a knife. "I would rather die than be owned by any man here." The perfect English shocked the crowd into silence. This wasn't the broken speech of someone with a passing knowledge of the language. These were the words of someone who understood exactly what was happening and refused to accept it. "She killed 2 men already," someone in the crowd muttered. "Heard tell one lost an eye before he managed to chain her." "Devil woman," another voice added. "Not worth the trouble." James felt something stir inside him, something he thought had died with Elizabeth. A sense of purpose, perhaps. Or maybe just the recognition that sometimes the world presented you with a clear choice between what was easy and what was right. $3, James said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent auction yard. Heads turned. Men who knew James Blackwood stared in disbelief. He was the last person anyone expected to bid on an Apache captive, especially given what had happened to his daughter. James stepped forward, pulling 3 worn dollar bills from his pocket. He approached the platform slowly, aware of Nara's eyes tracking his every movement. There was no gratitude in that gaze, only calculation and perhaps a hint of confusion. Crane recovered quickly, snatching the money from James's hand. "Sold to Blackwood," he announced, clearly relieved to have made any sale at all. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some men drifted away, disappointed by the lack of drama. Others lingered, curious to see what would happen next. James climbed the steps to the platform, stopping a respectful distance from Nara. He could feel the intensity of her gaze, sizing him up, likely calculating her chances against him. "I'm going to remove these," he said quietly, gesturing to her chains. "I expect you'll be reasonable about it." "Reasonable?" she replied, the word laced with contempt. "Like you men were reasonable when you burned our homes? When you shot children for sport? When you herded us like cattle onto land that cannot sustain life?" James met her gaze steadily. "I can't answer for other men's crimes. I can only tell you I have no intention of keeping you captive." Disbelief flashed across her face, quickly replaced by suspicion. Crane leaned close to James, whispering urgently, "Watch yourself with this one, Blackwood." She put a knife through Jenkins's leg, nearly bled out before they got him to a doctor. "And Simmons will never see out of his right eye again." "Sounds like they deserved it," James replied evenly. Taking the key, Crane reluctantly handed him. He approached Nara carefully, showing her the key. "May I?" The question, rather than a command, seemed to surprise her. She extended her wrists slightly, though her body remained tense, ready to fight or flee. James unlocked the manacles, noting the raw skin beneath. Anger flared inside him at the evidence of mistreatment, but he kept his expression neutral. The chains fell to the platform with a heavy clank. Nara rubbed her wrists, her eyes never leaving James's face. "What game are you playing, white man?" "No game," he replied. "I have a horse tied at the hitching post. There's water and food in the saddlebags. You're welcome to whatever you need." Several men watching from below called out warnings. "You're making a mistake, Blackwood. She'll knife you in your sleep." James ignored them, stepping back to give Nara space. He gestured toward the steps. "After you." Nara hesitated, clearly trying to understand his motives. Finally, she moved past him and descended the steps. James followed at a distance, aware of how the crowd parted to let them through, many hands hovering near weapons. He led her to his mare, a sturdy chestnut that eyed the stranger with caution. James untied the reins but made no move to mount. Instead, he opened a saddlebag and pulled out a canteen, offering it to Nara. "Drink, the desert's unforgiving this time of year." Nara accepted the canteen but didn't drink immediately. "Why did you buy me?" The directness of the question caught James off guard, though he should have expected it. He considered how to answer, finally settling on the truth, or at least part of it. "Because no human being should be in chains." "Pretty words," she replied. "But I've heard pretty words from white men before. They mean nothing." James nodded, accepting the rebuke. "Fair enough. Judge me by what I do, not what I say." Nara finally drank from the canteen, thirst overcoming caution. Water trickled down her chin as she gulped deeply. "There's a trading post run by a woman named Margaret Wilson about 2 days west of here," James said. "She helps people who need it, asks no questions. I can take you there." "And what do you want in return?" Nara asked, wariness evident in every line of her body. "Nothing," James replied. "Once you're safely at Wilson's place, we go our separate ways." The suspicion in Nara's eyes didn't waver. James couldn't blame her. In her position, he wouldn't trust a stranger's generosity either. "I'll walk," she said finally. "You can ride your horse." James nodded, understanding her need to maintain some control. "As you wish." And so they left Prescott, an unlikely pair drawing curious stares. The grieving rancher and the warrior woman, walking side by side yet separated by a chasm of history and mistrust. They had traveled no more than 5 miles from town, following a faint trail that wound through scrub and cactus, when Nara made her move. James had been expecting it. The moment they crossed a ridge, putting Prescott out of sight, she broke into a run, veering sharply away from the trail and heading deeper into the desert. James made no attempt to chase her. Instead, he mounted his mare and followed at a distance, keeping Nara in sight but giving her the space to make her own choice. He knew the terrain, knew that without water and shelter, the desert would claim her life before sunset tomorrow. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Nara ran, her form shimmering in the heat haze. James tracked her easily, noting how she initially ran in a straight line before beginning to zigzag, using what little cover the landscape provided. It was the movement of someone trained in evasion, but also the desperate flight of a person with no clear destination. After nearly an hour, her pace slowed. Another 30 minutes and she was walking, then stumbling. When she finally collapsed to her knees, James approached, dismounting while still at a respectful distance. "The nearest water is 10 miles south," he said quietly. "Or we can continue west toward Wilson's trading post. Your choice." Nara looked up at him, her face streaked with sweat and dust, her eyes burning with frustration and anger. "Why follow me? Why not let me die out here if that's what I choose?" James removed the canteen from his saddle and placed it on the ground between them. "Is that what you choose? To die in the desert when you could live and fight another day?" Nara stared at the canteen, then at James. "What do you know of fighting?" "I served 4 years in the Union Army during the war. Saw things no man should see. Did things no man should have to do." James looked out at the horizon. "And I've been fighting my own battles since my daughter died 8 months ago." Something in his tone must have reached her because Nara took the canteen and drank deeply before asking, "How did she die?" James met her gaze directly. She was teaching Apache children to read at a missionary outpost. A border skirmish broke out. She was caught in the crossfire. Understanding dawned in Nara's eyes. "And yet you bought me freedom." I couldn't save her," James said simply. Maybe I can help you. Nara studied him for a long moment, assessing the truth in his words. Finally, she nodded. The trading post. We go there. James gestured to his horse. You should ride. The heat will drain your strength quickly. Nara shook her head. I walk, but beside you now, not behind. It was a small concession, but an important one. As they resumed their journey, James felt the weight of her scrutiny. He understood it was not trust, merely a temporary alignment of their interests. For now, that would have to be enough. They walked in silence for miles, the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps on the sandy soil, the only sound besides the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the desert floor, James spotted a suitable place to make camp, a small formation of rocks that would provide some shelter and protection from the wind. We should stop here for the night, he said, gesturing to the rocks. Traveling after dark is dangerous in this terrain. Nara nodded, her practicality overriding any remaining desire to flee. She helped gather brush for a small fire while James unsaddled his mare and set out their meager provisions. As flames began to dance in the gathering dusk, James handed Nara a portion of jerky and dried fruit. She accepted it wordlessly, but didn't eat immediately, watching as James took his own share and began to eat. The marks on your face, James said after a while, they have meaning. Nara touched the symbol on her forehead. This one is for my brother who died defending our people. Her fingers moved to her cheek. This one is for the children I have sworn to protect. Finally, she traced the mark near her jaw. And this one is for the person I will become if I survive this journey. You said children, James noted. Not your children? Nara's expression softened slightly. Children of my tribe, many orphaned by your soldiers or by disease. I gather them, teach them, keep them safe. The parallel to Elizabeth was so stark that James felt a physical ache in his chest. His daughter, too, had been drawn to teaching children, not her own, believing in the power of knowledge to transform lives. Where are these children now? James asked. Nara's gaze grew distant, focused on something beyond the firelight. Hidden, safe, I hope. She turned her attention back to James. Why did you really buy me? $3 is nothing, but a man does not help his enemy without reason. James stared into the fire, gathering his thoughts. Finally, he looked up and met her gaze directly. 8 months ago, a group of soldiers fired on a missionary outpost, believing Apache raiders were using it as cover. My daughter Elizabeth was inside, teaching children to read. By the time I arrived, responding to news of trouble, she was already gone. James paused, the memory still raw. The official report claimed it was an Apache arrow that killed her, but I've seen enough wounds to know a bullet when I see one. Some young, frightened soldier fired without identifying his target. And you knew this soldier? Nara asked, her perception keen. I knew his commanding officer, Colonel Maxwell Hammond. We served together in the war. James's voice hardened. He gave the order to fire, even though he knew Elizabeth volunteered there. Even though the raiders they were pursuing were more likely families seeking food and medicine. Yet you do not seek vengeance, Nara observed. Vengeance won't bring Elizabeth back, James replied, and it won't honor what she believed in. She saw humanity in everyone she met, even those others feared or hated. Nara considered this, turning the dried meat over in her hands before finally taking a bite. They ate in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. These children you protect, James said eventually. Where are they now? Nara hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Hidden in caves in the Sierra Ancha Mountains, 14 of them, ages 5 to 12. Alone? The older ones care for the younger ones. I taught them how to survive. Pride mingled with worry in her voice. I was captured 3 weeks ago, trying to lead soldiers away from their hiding place. James nodded, understanding dawning. You sacrificed your freedom for theirs. As any mother would do for her children, Nara replied, though she had earlier indicated they weren't her biological offspring. How long can they survive alone? They have food and water for perhaps another week. Nara's voice grew strained. After that, they must either move or starve. James stared into the fire, thinking. The mountains she mentioned were at least 3 days' hard ride north, in the opposite direction from Wilson's trading post. Going there would mean abandoning the relative safety of his original plan, risking encounter with patrols, possibly even Hammond himself. Before he could respond, a sound from beyond their small circle of firelight caught his attention. The soft but unmistakable clink of metal against metal, followed by the quiet crunch of a boot on gravel. Nara heard it too, her body tensing as her hand moved instinctively to her side where a weapon should have been. James slowly reached for his rifle, lying within arm's reach. "We have company," he murmured. The darkness beyond the firelight suddenly gave way to three figures, each holding a rifle pointed directly at the camp. At their center stood Colonel Maxwell Hammond, his gray mustache and military bearing unmistakable, even in the dim light. "Well, well," Hammond said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a career military man. "James Blackwood, I heard rumors you'd gone native, but I didn't quite believe it until now." Colonel Maxwell Hammond stood at the edge of the firelight, flanked by two younger men in cavalry uniforms. At 58, Hammond retained the ramrod posture and commanding presence that had earned him respect during the war. His gray hair was cropped short beneath his military hat, his mustache neatly trimmed above a mouth now curved in a cold smile. "Colonel," James acknowledged, keeping his tone neutral while his mind raced through options. His rifle lay just beyond comfortable reach. "That's a dangerous Apache you're harboring, Blackwood," Hammond said, gesturing toward Nara with his rifle barrel. "A known agitator and killer." Nara remained perfectly still, her expression revealing nothing, though James could sense the tension coiled in her body, ready to spring. "She's no threat to anyone here," James replied evenly. "We're just passing through the territory." Hammond's laugh held no humor. "Passing through with a woman who's killed two of my men and incited rebellion among the reservation Apache?" He shook his head. "I don't think so." "I bought her fair and square at auction," James said. "She's under my protection now." "Protection?" Hammond's voice hardened. "Like you protected your daughter?" The barb struck deep, but James kept his expression neutral. "Elizabeth has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with this," Hammond countered. "Ever since she died, you've been undermining military authority in this territory, questioning official reports, suggesting that my men fired without proper cause. I know a bullet wound when I see one, Colonel." Hammond stepped closer, his rifle still trained on James. "You know what I see, Blackwood? A man destroyed by grief. A man looking for someone to blame. A man who's forgotten which side he's on in this war." "There is no war," James replied, "just people trying to survive. Tell that to the settlers who've been raided. Tell that to the stagecoach drivers who've been ambushed." Hammond's gaze shifted to Nara. "Tell that to the families of the men she killed." "Your men attacked me first," Nara said suddenly, her voice steady. "I defended myself." Hammond's eyes narrowed. "You'll hang for what you've done." "She's not going anywhere with you," James said, slowly rising to his feet. "Whatever grievance you have with me, Colonel, leave her out of it." A cold smile spread across Hammond's face. "This isn't about grievances, Blackwood. This is about justice. Justice for the men who died. Justice for the territory." "Justice?" James scoffed. "Or is it about the promotion you lost when questions were raised about Elizabeth's death? About the inquiry that followed when I pushed for the truth?" Hammond's expression darkened. "You were always too smart for your own good, Blackwood. Too moral. Too concerned with the letter of the law rather than its spirit." He gestured to his men. "Take the Apache woman. We'll deal with Blackwood separately." As the soldiers moved forward, Nara suddenly lunged for the fire, grabbing a burning branch and swinging it in a wide arc. Sparks flew as she struck one soldier across the face, sending him reeling backward with a cry of pain. James seized the moment of confusion to dive for his rifle. Rolling to one knee, he chambered around and aimed not at Hammond, but at the ground near his feet. "Tell your men to stand down, Colonel," James commanded, his voice deadly calm. "No one needs to die tonight." Hammond, his rifle now aimed at James, hesitated. The standoff stretched, seconds feeling like hours. Finally, he raised his hand, signaling his men to hold position. "You're making a grave mistake, Blackwood," Hammond warned, "siding with an Apache against your own kind." "My kind are people who value human life," James replied. "People who keep their word. People who don't murder children and call it military necessity." Nara stood beside James now, the burning branch still in her hand, its flame illuminating the fierce determination on her face. "You know what she is, Blackwood," Hammond said, his voice lower now. "A savage. A killer." "I know she's a woman who sacrificed her freedom to protect children," James replied, "which makes her more honorable than you'll ever be." Hammond's face contorted with fury. "This isn't over. The territory isn't big enough for you to hide in." "We're not hiding," James said. "Now back away slowly. Take your men and go." For a tense moment, it seemed Hammond might refuse. Then, with a curt nod to his men, he began to retreat into the darkness. "I'll be seeing you again, Blackwood," he called. Both of you." Only when the sound of their horses had faded into the distance did James lower his rifle. Beside him, Nara dropped the burning branch back into the fire, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. "He will return with more men," she said quietly. "Yes," James agreed, "which means we need to move quickly." He began packing up their meager camp. "Those children in the mountains, how quickly can we reach them?" Surprise flickered across Nara's face. "We?" James nodded. "I'm not letting 14 children die in the wilderness, and I'm not letting Hammond get his hands on you." For the first time since they'd met, Nara's expression softened. Not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "3 days by horse," she said. "Faster if we travel light and through the night." James finished saddling his mare, working by the dying firelight. "Then we'd best get started." He offered her the reins. "You should ride. We'll make better time." After a moment's hesitation, Nara accepted, mounting the horse with practiced ease. James walked alongside, leading the mare as they set off under the silver light of a quarter moon. Behind them, the fire dwindled to embers, then darkness as they made their way north toward the Sierra Ancha Mountains and the children who waited there, unaware that their lives hung in the balance of this unlikely alliance between a grieving rancher and a defiant warrior. Dawn broke in pale fingers of light across the eastern horizon as James and Nara continued their journey north. They had traveled through most of the night, stopping only when the terrain became too treacherous to navigate in darkness. James walked beside his mare, which Nara rode, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The warrior had proven to be an excellent navigator, guiding them through narrow passes and hidden trails that no military patrol would think to check. "We should reach the foothills by nightfall," Nara said, breaking a long silence. "From there, another full day to the caves," James nodded, conserving his energy. At 52, he was still strong, but the night of walking had taken its toll. His boots were worn thin at the heels, and a blister had formed on his left foot, though he said nothing of it. "Hammond will expect us to head west toward the trading post," he observed. "That gives us some time, but not much. Once he realizes we've gone north instead, he'll know where we're headed." "How can you be certain?" "Because he's been hunting for those children for months," James replied. "The official story is that they're being harbored by renegade warriors planning attacks on settlements. Hammond has used that story to justify increased patrols in Apache territory." Nara's expression darkened. "There are no warriors, only children whose parents were killed or taken to the reservation." "I know," James said quietly. "Hammond needs enemies to fight. It justifies his position, his authority. Without conflict, men like him become irrelevant." The terrain gradually changed as they moved northward. The open desert gave way to scrubland dotted with juniper and piñon pine. Small game scurried through the underbrush, and once they spotted a pair of mule deer watching them warily from a distance. "We should hunt," Nara suggested. "The children will need food." James considered this. "Too risky. Gunshots carry for miles in this country. We'll buy supplies at the last trading post before the mountains." Nara frowned. "They will remember us." "Not if we're careful," James replied. "I know the owner, Sam Turnbull, fought alongside his brother in the war. He's no friend to the military." As the sun climbed higher, the heat intensified. James paused to drink sparingly from his canteen, then offered it to Nara, who shook her head. "You need it more," she said. "I grew up in this desert. My body knows how to preserve water." James couldn't help but admire her resilience. Despite her ordeal of capture and the auction, she showed no signs of weakness or self-pity. He wondered what experiences had forged such strength in her. As if reading his thoughts, Nara spoke. "You said your daughter taught Apache children to read. Why would she do this?" James walked in silence for a moment, the questions stirring memories both painful and precious. Elizabeth believed that knowledge was the path to understanding, he finally answered, and understanding was the path to peace. She used to say that a person who can read is never truly powerless. Nara seemed to consider this. Our stories are spoken, not written. They live in the breath of our elders, in the memories we pass down. Does this make us powerless? Not powerless, James replied thoughtfully, but vulnerable in a different way. When the government wants to destroy a people, they often start by attacking their language, their stories. This is true, Nara acknowledged. At the reservation school, they cut the hair of our children, forbid them to speak our language, punish them for practicing our ways. That's why Elizabeth wanted to teach reading on Apache terms, James explained. Not to replace your stories, but to give your children another tool to preserve them, to write down what might otherwise be lost. Something shifted in Nara's expression, a newfound curiosity about Elizabeth, and perhaps about James himself. These children in the mountains, James continued, you teach them your ways? Yes, Nara replied, pride evident in her voice, but also how to survive in your world. They must know both to have any future. As they talked, the sun continued its arc across the sky. By mid-afternoon, they had reached more densely vegetated terrain, with cottonwoods marking the path of a seasonal creek, now dry. James checked his bearings against the sun's position. The trading post should be about 5 miles ahead, he said. We'll arrive close to sunset. Best time when Turnbull will be closing up and fewer people will be around. Nara nodded in agreement. What will you tell him? As little as possible, James replied. The less he knows, the safer for everyone. They continued in companionable silence until James suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt. Ahead on the trail, dust rose in a telltale cloud. Riders, he whispered. Get down, now. Nara slid silently from the horse. James led the mare quickly into a dense thicket of mesquite, Nara following. They crouched low, waiting as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. 6 cavalrymen appeared around the bend in the trail, their blue uniforms distinct against the desert backdrop. At their head rode a sergeant James recognized from Prescott, a hard man named Ellis, who had a reputation for harsh treatment of Indians. Army patrol, James breathed. Looking for us, most likely. Nara tensed beside him, her hand instinctively reaching for a weapon she didn't have. James placed a restraining hand on her arm, a silent plea for patience. The patrol drew closer, horses moving at a walk, the men scanning the terrain. When they were almost level with the hiding place, the sergeant raised his hand, calling the patrol to a halt. Water break, he announced. 10 minutes. James and Nara remained motionless as the soldiers dismounted, leading their horses to the shade of the cottonwoods. One soldier passed so close to their hiding spot that James could have reached out and touched his boot. You really think Blackwood's helping that Apache woman, Sarge? A young private asked, unscrewing his canteen. Colonel Hammond seems to think so, Ellis replied. Says Blackwood's gone soft on Indians since his daughter got killed. Another soldier spat into the dust. Heard she was teaching redskin kids to read. No wonder she got herself shot. James felt Nara's muscles tense beneath his hand. His own anger flared, but he forced himself to remain still. Orders are to bring them both in, Ellis continued. Blackwood for questioning, the Apache woman for hanging. What about those kids Hammond's been looking for? Another soldier asked. Ellis shrugged. If we find them, we take them to the reservation school. If they resist, he let the implication hang in the air. The young private looked uncomfortable. They're just children, Sarge. They grow up to be warriors, Ellis replied sharply. You remember what happened to Jenkins's patrol last spring? James felt a chill at the casual cruelty in the sergeant's voice. These were men following orders, but they had convinced themselves of the righteousness of those orders, just as men had done in the war on both sides. After what seemed an eternity, the sergeant ordered his men back into the saddle. The patrol moved on, continuing west along the trail. Only when the dust had settled and the last hoofbeat had faded did James release his breath. They're heading toward the trading post, he said. We need to find another way. Nara nodded, her expression grim. There is a path through the hills, longer but safer. Lead on, James replied, grateful for her knowledge of the terrain. As they set off on their detour, James pondered the sergeant's words. Hammond was clearly spreading the word about them, perhaps even offering a reward. Their journey had just become considerably more dangerous. The detour took them into rougher country, a maze of rocky ravines and steep slopes covered in loose scree. Nara led the way on foot now, the terrain too treacherous for riding. James followed, leading his increasingly reluctant mare over ground better suited to mountain goats than horses. There was a time I could navigate this blindfolded, Nara remarked, picking her way down a particularly steep slope. My brother and I would race through these canyons as children. Your brother, James said, remembering the mark on her forehead. What happened to him? Nara was silent for a moment, focused on finding a path. When she spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with old grief. He was killed 5 years ago. A cavalry patrol found him hunting alone. They claimed he had attacked them. 6 armed soldiers against 1 man with a bow. Her tone made clear what she thought of this story. I'm sorry, James said, the words inadequate but sincere. He taught me everything I know about surviving, Nara continued. How to track, how to hunt, how to read the stars. After our parents died, he raised me as his own daughter, though he was only 4 years older. James recognized the deep respect in her voice. He sounds like an honorable man. He was, Nara agreed. He would have approved of what I do with the children. She paused, looking back at James, and perhaps even of you. The unexpected comment caught James off guard. Before he could respond, a rumble of thunder sounded in the distance. Looking up, he saw dark clouds gathering over the mountains ahead. Storm coming, he observed. We should find shelter. Nara scanned the terrain, then pointed to a narrow opening in the cliff face about 200 yards ahead. There, a cave system. Small entrance, but opens wider inside. They quickened their pace, reaching the cave entrance just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. The opening was indeed narrow, forcing James to remove his saddlebags and lead his horse carefully through the tight passage. Inside, the space widened into a natural chamber about 15 feet across, the ceiling high enough that James could stand upright. We were fortunate, Nara said, settling herself on a flat rock near the entrance. These summer storms can be violent but brief. As if in confirmation, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the air, followed by a deluge of rain that transformed the landscape outside into a blur. Water began to cascade down the cliff face, creating a shimmering curtain across the cave entrance. James unsaddled his mare, rubbing the animal down with a piece of blanket from his pack. The horse, relieved to be out of the storm, nickered softly and nuzzled his shoulder in gratitude. Your horse trusts you, Nara observed. Animals know who they can trust. Horses are better judges of character than most people, James replied, patting the mare's neck. The storm intensified, lightning flashing across the darkened sky and thunder rolling through the canyons like the drums of an angry god. The temperature dropped noticeably, a welcome relief after the heat of the day. James settled himself against the cave wall, stretching his tired legs before him. The blister on his foot had worsened, and he removed his boot to examine it. The skin was raw and inflamed, promising pain for the miles ahead. Nara noticed his discomfort. Without comment, she moved to his side and examined the injury. From a small pouch at her waist, she extracted some dried leaves, crushing them between her fingers. Yarrow, she explained. It will prevent infection and ease the pain. James watched as she mixed the crushed leaves with a little water from his canteen, creating a poultice which she applied to the blister with gentle efficiency. The cooling effect was immediate, the pain receding to a dull throb. Thank you, he said, genuinely grateful. Nara secured the poultice with a strip of cloth torn from her own garment. We cannot afford for you to become lame. The children need us both at full strength. As she worked, James noticed faded scars on her wrists where the manacles had been, and older marks across her hands and forearms, evidence of a life of hard work and occasional violence. How did you come to be caring for these children? He asked. Nara finished bandaging his foot before answering. It began with 3, orphans from a village struck by smallpox 2 winters ago. Their parents had been friends of my brother. I could not leave them to die. She moved back to her rock, drawing her knees up to her chest in a posture that somehow made her seem younger. Then came 2 more, their mother killed when soldiers burned their camp. Then 4 whose parents had been forced onto the reservation. She sighed. Soon there were 14, and I realized we could not keep moving as we had been. The smallest ones could not travel fast enough when danger came. "So you found the caves," James prompted. "Yes, high up, difficult to reach, with a spring inside for water. I thought they would be safe there while I hunted and gathered food." Her expression darkened. But Hammond's patrols kept getting closer. Someone had told them about children hiding in the mountains. Outside, the storm began to abate, the thunder more distant now, the rain slackening to a steady patter. "3 weeks ago, I decided to lead them away," Nara continued. "I deliberately let myself be seen by a patrol, then led them south away from the caves. I thought if they captured me, they would assume the children were nearby and concentrate their search in the wrong area." "A brave plan," James said, "and it worked, except for your capture." Nara's laugh was without humor. "They were not gentle with their questions. When I would not tell them where the children were, they decided I was worth more alive than dead. Hence the auction." James felt a surge of anger at what she must have endured. "And the men you injured?" "The first tried to force himself on me while I was chained in their camp. I managed to grab his knife." Her expression showed no remorse. "The second tried the same while I was supposedly sleeping. I may have been chained, but my fingers were still free." James nodded, understanding completely. In her position, he would have done the same or worse. The rain finally stopped, though water continued to drip from the cave entrance. The late afternoon light had a strange golden quality, filtered through the lingering clouds and mist rising from the heated ground. "We should move on soon," Nara said, rising to her feet. "The storm has washed away our tracks. It is good protection." James began to prepare his horse, reattaching the saddle and securing his few possessions. As he worked, a thought occurred to him. "These children," he said, "they must be frightened, having been alone for so long. They might not trust a stranger, especially one who looks like me." Nara considered this. "Dakota, the oldest boy, speaks some English. He will understand when I explain. The others will follow his lead." She paused. "But it would be wise for me to approach alone first, to reassure them." "Agreed," James said, cinching the saddle tight. "I'll wait at a distance until they're comfortable with my presence." They exited the cave to find the world transformed by the storm. The dry creek bed below now carried a rushing torrent of muddy water. The scrub land glistened, every leaf and branch adorned with droplets that caught the late afternoon sun. "The creek will slow Hammond if he follows us," James observed, "but it also means we need to find a crossing further upstream." Nara pointed to the north where the hills rose toward distant peaks. "There is a place 2 miles ahead where the creek narrows. We can cross there." They set off once more, James leading his mare through terrain made treacherous by mud and loose rocks. Despite the added difficulty, he felt a strange sense of purpose, stronger than anything he had known since Elizabeth's death. For the first time in months, he was doing something that mattered, something his daughter would have approved of. As they navigated a particularly steep slope, Nara suddenly stopped, holding up her hand for silence. James froze, following her gaze to a ridge about a quarter-mile away. A lone figure sat astride a horse, silhouetted against the sky. Even at this distance, James recognized the military bearing, the straight spine and squared shoulders of a cavalry officer. The figure remained motionless, watching. "Hammond," James whispered. Nara nodded, her body tense. "He knows these mountains better than I thought." "Or he has a guide who does," James replied grimly. "Someone who knows where the children are hidden." For several heartbeats, they stood frozen, watching the distant figure. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Hammond turned his horse and disappeared over the ridge. "Why didn't he pursue us?" Nara wondered aloud. "Because he doesn't need to," James replied, a chill running through him despite the warm air. "He's letting us lead him to the children." As night fell, James and Nara pushed onward, using the last light to cross the swollen creek at a narrow point where rocks provided a precarious bridge. The water rushed beneath them, brown with silt and debris carried down from the mountains. Once across, they continued into increasingly rugged terrain, the foothills of the Sierra Ancha rising around them. "We need to assume Hammond is following," James said, as they picked their way through a boulder field, "possibly with others." Nara nodded, her expression grave. "If he has found an Apache guide willing to betray his own people, then he may already know where the caves are. Why would any Apache help him?" "Hunger," Nara replied simply. At the reservation, they control the food. Cooperate or starve. Some choose to cooperate. James considered this harsh reality. Is there another approach to the caves, a way Hammond might not know about? Nara thought for a moment. Yes, more difficult, but known only to my brother and me. We used it as children to escape when the elders were angry with our mischief. Then that's our route, James decided. They traveled in darkness now, navigating by starlight and Nara's intimate knowledge of the landscape. The going was slow and treacherous, requiring all their concentration. James marveled at Nara's ability to find a path where he saw only chaos, to distinguish one rocky outcrop from another when all looked identical to his eyes. How much further, he asked after what seemed hours of climbing. We'll reach the hidden approach by dawn, Nara replied, then another few hours to the caves themselves. James nodded, conserving his breath for the climb. His legs ached, and the blister on his foot, despite Nara's treatment, throbbed with each step. But these discomforts paled beside the urgency of their mission. As they ascended, the vegetation changed, juniper and pinon giving way to ponderosa pine and scrub oak. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Once they startled a mountain lion, its tawny form melting into the shadows with fluid grace. A good omen, Nara said softly. Mountain lion is a protector of children in our stories. Near midnight, they stopped briefly to rest. James shared the last of his jerky with Nara, both of them eating sparingly, knowing they needed to make their supplies last. His mare grazed on patches of grass growing between rocks, the animal as tired as they were but still sure-footed on the difficult terrain. Tell me about the children, James said as they rested. What are they like? Nara's face softened in the starlight. Dakota is the oldest at 12, serious beyond his years, always watching over the others. He lost both parents to a cavalry attack 2 years ago. And the youngest? Twins, Kimmy and Kai, 5 years old. Their mother died in childbirth. Their father was taken to a reservation far to the south. They barely remember him now. She sighed. Then there's Nima, 6 years old, the one who asks the most questions. Always wanting to know why the sky is blue, why the rain falls, why the world is as it is. Sounds like Elizabeth, James said with a sad smile. She never stopped asking questions. Drove her mother and me to distraction sometimes. Nara nodded in understanding. Children who ask questions grow into adults who find answers. They resumed their journey, climbing ever higher into the mountains. James noticed that Nara was becoming increasingly alert, her gaze constantly scanning their surroundings, her head tilting occasionally as if listening for sounds beyond his perception. What is it? He finally asked. We are being watched, she replied quietly. I have felt it for the past hour. James tensed, his hand moving to his rifle. Hammond? No, Nara said. Something else. Something. She trailed off, then suddenly called out in Apache, her voice echoing among the rocks. Silence answered her, then, faintly, a bird call that James recognized as a quail. Except quail didn't call at night. Nara's face broke into a rare smile. She responded with a similar call, and moments later a small figure appeared on a ledge above them, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Dakota, Nara called softly in English. It is safe. I have brought help. The boy scrambled down from his perch with the agility of a mountain goat, moving from rock to rock with practiced ease. When he reached them, James could see he was tall for his age, with intense dark eyes that assessed James with immediate suspicion. Even in his youth, Dakota carried himself with the unmistakable air of someone who had taken on responsibility beyond his years. Who is he? Dakota demanded in accented English, keeping his distance from James while positioning himself protectively between the stranger and the hidden entrance to the caves. A friend, Nara replied. He helped me escape. He wants to help all of you. Dakota's gaze remained skeptical as it moved from James to his uniform, then back to Nara. He is a soldier. Former soldier, James corrected gently. Now just a man trying to do what's right. Dakota turned back to Nara, switching to Apache in a rapid flow of words. His tone wasn't merely questioning, but authoritative, as if he were consulting with Nara rather than simply deferring to her. James couldn't understand the words, but the urgent tone and the boy's commanding presence were clear enough. Nara's expression grew increasingly concerned as Dakota spoke, nodding occasionally to acknowledge his points. "What is it?" James asked when they paused. "Soldiers," Nara translated grimly. "A patrol came near the caves 2 days ago. The children hid deeper inside, but the soldiers left 2 men to watch the main entrance." "Hammond," James muttered. "He's tightening the noose." "There's more," Nara continued, her voice tight with worry. "Nima is sick, fever, coughing. Dakota tried the remedies I taught him, but she grows worse." James felt a pang of alarm. In these conditions, without proper medicine, a simple illness could quickly become deadly, especially for a young child already weakened by hardship. "We need to get to them quickly," he said. "Is your hidden approach still unwatched?" Dakota nodded after Nara translated the question. "No soldiers there. Too difficult to climb." "Then lead the way," James urged. Dakota hesitated, looking to Nara for confirmation. When she nodded, he turned and began to climb, moving with the sure-footed confidence of one who knew every handhold. James secured his mare to a sturdy pine, leaving her with access to grass and the small pool of water that had collected in a rocky depression. The horse would have to wait. The path ahead was not navigable on horseback. They climbed in single file, Dakota leading, Nara following, and James bringing up the rear. The boys set a punishing pace, scrambling up near vertical faces with apparent ease. James, despite his experience in rugged terrain, found himself struggling to keep up. His boots slipping on surfaces, the others navigated effortlessly in their soft moccasins. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they reached a narrow ledge that wound around the face of a cliff. Below them, the valley floor was still in shadow, a patchwork of forest and meadow visible through the thinning darkness. "Stay close to the wall," Dakota instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do not look down." James pressed his back against the cool rock, edging along the precarious path, acutely aware of the drop to his right. The ledge was barely wide enough for his boots, forcing him to move sideways, one careful step at a time. Ahead, Dakota disappeared around a bend in the cliff face. Nara followed, her movements graceful and confident. James took a deep breath and continued, focusing on each step rather than the yawning space beside him. Rounding the bend, he found himself facing what appeared to be a solid wall of rock. Dakota and Nara had vanished. For a moment, he stood bewildered, wondering if he had somehow lost the trail. Then Nara's hand appeared, reaching out from a crack in the rock face so narrow it was nearly invisible until one was directly before it. James took her hand, allowing her to guide him into the crevice. Inside, the space widened immediately into a narrow tunnel that sloped upward into the mountain. The passage was dark, but ahead James could see the faint glow of early morning light filtering through some unseen opening. They moved forward in silence, the tunnel occasionally branching. Dakota always choosing without hesitation. After about 10 minutes of walking, the passage suddenly opened into a large chamber. Sunlight streamed through a narrow fissure high in the ceiling, illuminating a scene that caught James's breath. Children of various ages sat or lay on beds of pine boughs and tattered blankets. Some were sleeping, others watched the newcomers with fearful eyes. The chamber showed signs of long habitation, a small fire pit with ashes long cold, bundles of dried plants hanging from rocky protrusions, crude storage areas built from stacked stones. Dakota moved immediately to the side of a small girl lying on a bed of furs, her face flushed with fever. "Nima," he said simply. Nara rushed to the child, kneeling beside her and placing a gentle hand on her forehead. "She burns," she said, her voice tight with concern. James approached slowly, not wanting to frighten the children. As he drew nearer to Nima, he could hear the congestion in her lungs, the slight wheeze with each labored breath. "Lung fever," he said grimly, recognizing the telltale signs of pneumonia. "My wife suffered similarly before." He didn't finish the sentence. James carefully assessed the child's condition. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, with a distinctive wheeze that indicated fluid in the lungs. The flush of her cheeks against the pallor of her face, the slight blue tinge to her lips, these were not signs of a mild illness. Without proper treatment, children like Nima often didn't survive such infections, especially after weeks of malnutrition and stress. "How long has she been this way?" James asked, keeping his voice steady despite his concern. 3 days, Dakota answered. "At first, just coughing. Then yesterday, the fever came. She stopped eating. This morning, she would not wake easily. James nodded grimly. The progression was rapid, another worrying sign. She needs medicine, strong medicine, more than herbs can provide. The other children had gathered now, watching the stranger in their midst with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright fear. James counted 13, including Dakota and Nima, which meant one was missing. As the other children gathered around, James observed how they naturally looked to Dakota for guidance. Though Nara was clearly their maternal figure, Dakota had established himself as their protector during her absence. The younger ones stayed close to him, seeking his approval before approaching James. Even the older children waited for his subtle nods before answering James's questions. He became their leader when I was taken, Nara explained quietly, noticing James's observation. At 12, he organized watches, rationed food, maintained discipline. Without him, they might not have survived these weeks. James studied the boy with newfound respect. Responsibility like that changes a person. It has made him older than his years, Nara agreed, but not harder. He still tells stories to the little ones at night, still plays games to make them forget their hunger. James recognized in Dakota the same qualities he'd seen in young officers during the war. Those rare few who could balance authority with compassion, who led not through fear, but through earned respect. "Where is Kai?" Nara asked, noticing the same discrepancy. A girl of about 10, her hair in 2 long braids, answered in Apache. Nara's expression grew alarmed as she listened. "What is it?" James asked. "Kai went to get water from the spring yesterday and has not returned," Nara translated. "They were afraid to search for him with soldiers nearby." James felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. A 5-year-old boy, alone in this rugged wilderness for nearly a day. The chances of finding him alive were slim, and yet they had to try. "No, I'll look for him," he offered. "You stay with Nima and the others." Nara shook her head. "These mountains are a maze to those who don't know them. You would be lost within an hour." "Then who goes?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. "I will find Kai," Dakota said, stepping forward. "I know where the spring is. I know his favorite hiding places." James looked at the 12-year-old, seeing determination beyond his years in the set of his jaw. "Not alone," he said firmly. "I'll go with you." Dakota began to protest, but Nara interrupted in Apache, speaking rapidly. Whatever she said caused the boy to reconsider, though his expression remained dubious. "He will show you the way," Nara told James, "but be careful. The soldiers may still be watching." James nodded, checking his rifle to ensure it was loaded and ready. "What about Nima?" he asked, glancing at the feverish child. Nara's face was grim. "I will do what I can with the plants we have here, but she needs real medicine." James remembered the yarrow Nara had used on his blister. "Would that help? I could gather some on the search." "Yarrow helps wounds, not lung fever," Nara replied. "She needs willow bark for the fever, and something stronger for the infection in her lungs." James thought quickly. "My saddlebags. I have a small medical kit with quinine tablets. It's not ideal, but it might help reduce the fever." Nara's eyes widened slightly. "You did not mention this before." "I didn't think of it," James admitted. "It's an old army habit, carrying basic medicines. The bags are with my horse, about 2 miles back the way we came." Dakota spoke up. "I know a faster way down. We can get your medicine, then look for Kai." James nodded, grateful for the boy's knowledge. "Let's go then. We don't have time to waste." As they prepared to leave, Nara caught James's arm. "Be careful," she said quietly. "If Hammond's men find you—" "They won't," James assured her, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. Dakota led the way back through the tunnel system, taking a different branch that descended more steeply. They emerged from a small opening near the base of the cliff, well hidden by a stand of juniper. The boy moved with remarkable stealth, his feet finding purchase on surfaces that seemed impossibly precarious to James. Following Dakota's lead, James kept low and moved as quietly as his larger frame would allow. They skirted the edge of a small meadow, staying within the tree line, then began to descend toward the location where James had left his mare. They had covered perhaps half the distance when Dakota suddenly froze, dropping to a crouch and signaling for James to do the same. James complied instantly, straining to hear what had alerted the boy. Then he heard it too. Voices carried on the morning breeze. Male voices speaking English. "Spread out! came the unmistakable command of Colonel Hammond. They can't be far. The boy said the caves are just above this ridge. James felt a chill run through him. The boy. Someone had betrayed them after all. Someone who knew the location of the caves. Dakota's eyes widened in alarm. He understood enough English to grasp the danger. He turned to James, his expression a silent question. What do we do now? James assessed their situation quickly. They were caught between Hammond's men in the caves with Nara and the children trapped above. His mare, with its precious cargo of medicine, was still some distance away. And somewhere in these mountains, a 5-year-old boy wandered alone, possibly injured, definitely frightened. He motioned Dakota closer, speaking in a whisper. How many ways into the caves? 3, Dakota replied softly. The way we came. The main entrance where soldiers watch, and one more, very small, only for children. James nodded, thinking rapidly. Can you reach my horse alone, bring back the medicine? Dakota hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but what about Kai? I'll keep looking for him, James promised. But first, I need to warn Nara about Hammond. The boy considered this, clearly torn between concern for his missing friend and the urgency of getting medicine to Nima. Finally, he nodded. I will get your medicine. You find Kai. James quickly described where he had left his mare and what the medical kit looked like. It's a small tin box in the left saddlebag. Take it directly back to Nara. Don't wait for me. Dakota slipped away like a shadow, moving downhill through the trees. James watched him go, hoping he had made the right decision sending a 12-year-old on such a critical mission. But Dakota knew these mountains intimately, and James was needed elsewhere. The voices of Hammond's men grew louder, then faded as they moved along the ridge. James took advantage of their momentary distance to climb to a better vantage point, finding a position behind a large boulder that offered both cover and a view of the surrounding terrain. From here, he could see Hammond himself, accompanied by 6 soldiers and a civilian who could only be the guide. The man wore traditional Apache clothing, but moved with the demeanor of someone who had spent considerable time among whites. James felt a surge of anger at this betrayal, then forced himself to focus on the immediate threat. Hammond was organizing his men into search parties, pointing out different approaches to the cliff face. With sinking heart, James realized the colonel had a good understanding of the cave system's layout. The guide had been thorough in his betrayal. James needed to warn Nara, but reaching the caves meant crossing open ground that Hammond's men would surely be watching. He needed a distraction. An idea formed, dangerous but potentially effective. If he could draw Hammond and his men away from the caves, it might give Nara and the children time to escape. But to where, and what about Kai? As if in answer to his unspoken question, a faint sound reached his ears, the high, frightened cry of a child. It came from the direction of the spring, perhaps half a mile to the west of his position. Kai. James's decision was made. He would find the boy, then create a diversion to draw Hammond away from the caves. Dakota would bring the medicine to Nara, and together they would lead the children out through the smallest exit, the one only they could navigate. Moving carefully to avoid detection, James began making his way toward the spring. The terrain was challenging, rocky outcrops alternating with dense stands of juniper and pine. He kept low, using every bit of cover available, freezing in place whenever one of Hammond's search parties came into view. The spring, when he finally reached it, was a small but steady flow of water emerging from a crack in the cliff face, forming a clear pool before continuing downhill as a narrow stream. Evidence of recent disturbance was visible in the mud around the pool. Small footprints, a child's water skin lying abandoned on a rock. Kai? James called softly, scanning the area for any sign of the boy. No answer came, but as James circled the pool, he found more tracks leading away from the spring, up a steep, rocky slope. Following them carefully, he came to a narrow fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a small child to squeeze through. Kai? He called again, this time directly into the opening. My name is James. I'm a friend of Nara's. Are you in there? A small sound came from inside the fissure, something between a whimper and a word. James tried again, using what few Apache words he had learned from Nara. Finally, a small voice responded in halting English. Nara, where? She's with the other children, James replied gently. She sent me to find you. Are you hurt? A long pause, then, leg, hurt, cannot walk. James assessed the situation. The fissure was far too narrow for him to enter. He would need to coax the boy out somehow. Kai, I'm going to help you, but you need to come to me. Can you crawl to the opening? Another long pause. Scared. I know you're scared, James said, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. But I promise I'll protect you. Nara is waiting for you. No response this time. James tried a different approach. Dakota is brave to help me find you. Are you brave too, Kai? This seemed to strike the right chord. After a moment, James heard movement from within the fissure, the sound of small hands and knees on stone. Gradually, a tiny figure emerged into the daylight, blinking owlishly. Kai was small even for his 5 years, his black hair matted with dust, his face streaked with tears. His right leg was bloodied at the knee, the source of his inability to walk. But most concerning to James was the child's pallor and the glazed look in his eyes, suggesting the early stages of dehydration. Hello, Kai, James said gently, remaining still to avoid frightening the boy further. I'm James. Kai regarded him warily, clearly frightened by the unfamiliar face and the soldier's uniform James still wore despite his civilian status. But thirst and exhaustion had worn down his resistance. Water, the boy whispered. James slowly removed his canteen, offering it to Kai. The child took it eagerly, drinking in great gulps until James gently pulled it away. Not too fast, he cautioned. It will make you sick. He examined Kai's injured knee, relieved to find it was merely a bad scrape rather than a broken bone. Using water from his canteen, he cleaned the wound as best he could, then tore a strip from his own shirt to bind it. What happened? He asked as he worked. Kai's English was limited, but between words and gestures, James pieced together the story. The boy had come to fetch water as he did every day, but had heard soldiers talking nearby. Frightened, he had tried to hide in the fissure, injuring himself in the process. Unable to return to the caves, he had remained hidden through the night and following day. Brave boy, James said approvingly as he finished bandaging the knee. Now we need to get you back to Nara. But that presented a new problem. Hammond's men were still searching the area between their current position and the caves. Carrying a child, James would be slow and conspicuous, and Kai was in no condition to walk, even with support. A new sound caught his attention, the distant crack of a rifle, followed by shouts. Hammond's men had found something, or someone. James's blood ran cold at the thought of Dakota being discovered. Or worse, Nara and the children being cornered in the caves. He needed to act now. Gathering Kai in his arms, James began moving toward the sound, staying within cover as much as possible. The boy was light, disturbingly so, a testament to the hardships he had endured. As they drew closer to the source of the commotion, James set Kai down in a well-concealed hollow beneath an overhanging rock. Stay here, he instructed firmly. Do not come out until I return for you. Understand? Kai nodded solemnly, his dark eyes wide with fear, but also with a trust that James found humbling. Moving forward alone now, James approached the ridge where he had last seen Hammond. The sounds of pursuit had moved downhill, suggesting Hammond's men were chasing someone. Dakota, attempting to reach the horse? Or had Nara been forced to flee the caves? From his new vantage point, James could see Hammond and 3 of his men on horseback, following something or someone down into a ravine. The other soldiers were spread out along the ridge, maintaining positions where they could observe the cave entrances. James made a swift decision. If he could create a diversion significant enough to draw the remaining soldiers away from their posts, it might give whoever Hammond was pursuing a chance to escape and potentially allow Nara to evacuate the children from the caves. Looking around, he spotted a stand of dead pine trees near the ridge, their dry wood perfect tinder for a fire. With Hammond and half his force already drawn away, a fire might pull the remaining soldiers from their posts long enough to make a difference. It was a desperate plan, but they were in a desperate situation. James moved quickly to the dead pines, using his tinderbox to set the driest branches alight. The fire caught rapidly, spreading upward through the resinous wood with hungry intensity. Smoke billowed skyward, visible for miles in the clear mountain air. As James had hoped, the soldiers on the ridge immediately noticed, several of them abandoning their posts to investigate what they clearly feared was a signal fire set by Apache reinforcements. Taking advantage of the confusion, James circled back to Kai's hiding place. The boy was exactly where he had left him, curled into a tight ball beneath the rock overhang. "Come," James said urgently. "We must hurry." Gathering Kai once more in his arms, James began making his way toward the smallest of the cave entrances, the one Dakota had described as accessible only to children. If he could get Kai inside, the boy could alert Nara to the diversion and the opportunity to escape. The entrance, when he found it, was indeed tiny, a narrow gap between boulders that seemed barely large enough for Kai, let alone an adult. James set the boy down beside it. "Can you crawl through?" he asked. "Find Nara. Tell her to leave now while the soldiers are distracted." Kai looked at the opening, then back at James, clearly torn between fear of entering the dark passage alone and desire to reach the safety of Nara's presence. "Brave boy," James reminded him gently. Kai nodded, his small face setting in determination. He began to crawl into the opening, his injured knee causing him to wince, but not deterring his progress. "Tell Nara to take the children and go," James instructed as the boy disappeared into the darkness. "I will find you." Whether Kai heard or understood these final instructions, James couldn't know, but the boy had vanished into the mountain, hopefully to deliver his vital message. Now James faced a choice: try to reach his horse in the medicine Dakota might have failed to retrieve, or create another diversion to further confuse Hammond's forces. The smoke from his fire was already beginning to thin as the dead pines were rapidly consumed. Soon the soldiers would realize there was no Apache war party, just a solitary fire. A shout from below drew his attention. One of Hammond's men had spotted something, or someone. Looking down into the ravine, James saw a flash of movement. Dakota, running at full sprint toward the spot where James had left his mare. The boy was being pursued by two soldiers on horseback, their progress slowed by the rough terrain, but still gaining on him. Without hesitation, James raised his rifle, aiming not at the soldiers but at the ground near their horses. He fired twice in rapid succession. The shots had the desired effect. The horses reared in panic, throwing one rider and forcing the other to halt and regain control of his mount. Dakota, seizing the opportunity, disappeared into a dense thicket of juniper. James immediately relocated, knowing his position was now compromised. He moved laterally along the ridge, seeking a path that would allow him to reach Dakota before the soldiers regrouped. As he ran, a new worry gnawed at him. The gunfire would surely alert Hammond to his presence, potentially endangering Nara's escape with the children. He had to find Dakota, secure the medicine, and somehow ensure the children's safe passage from the caves. The maze of ravines and ridges that had earlier seemed an obstacle now became an advantage, allowing James to move unseen toward the location of his horse. He prayed Dakota had reached it, had found the medicine, and was even now making his way back to the caves. But as he rounded a bend in a dry stream bed, James came face to face with the last person he expected to see. Nara herself carrying Nima in her arms, with 11 other children following in a silent, frightened line behind her. James stood frozen for a moment, absorbing the unexpected sight before him. Nara's face was drawn with exhaustion, her arms trembling slightly under the weight of Nima, whose small body was racked with fever. The other children huddled close together, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "How did you?" James began, then shook his head. Questions could wait. "Hammond's men are everywhere. It's not safe." "Kai found us," Nara explained quickly, "told us about the fire, the distraction. We left through the smallest passage. The soldiers at the main entrance never saw us." James nodded, relief washing over him. "Dakota went for medicine. My horse is just beyond that ridge." He gestured to the south. "We need to reach him before Hammond's men do." "Some of the children cannot go much further," Nara said, adjusting Nima in her arms. "They have not eaten since yesterday." James made a swift assessment. The children ranged from Nima's age to about 10, all showing signs of exhaustion and hunger. They had likely been surviving on minimal rations even before their supplies ran low. "There's a sheltered depression about a quarter-mile back," he decided. "You can hide there with the younger ones. I'll find Dakota and my horse, then come back for you." Nara hesitated, clearly reluctant to separate. "Hammond's men will not stop looking." "No," James agreed, "but they'll be focusing on the caves now, not expecting you to have already escaped. We have a small window of opportunity." A distant shout reinforced his point. Hammond's men were regrouping, likely preparing for a more systematic search. "Take them," James urged. "I'll find you." Nara nodded, her trust in him now apparent. She spoke rapidly to the children in Apache, and they began to move in the direction James had indicated, keeping low and following natural cover. James waited until they were safely on their way, then turned and continued toward his horse's location. He moved swiftly but cautiously, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. The smoke from his diversionary fire had mostly dissipated, but it had served its purpose, drawing Hammond's attention away from the children's escape route. As he neared the spot where he had tethered his mare, James heard the soft nickering of a horse. Dropping to a crouch, he approached more carefully, scanning for signs of Dakota or potential threats. The mare was still there, seemingly untouched, grazing placidly on the sparse mountain grass. Of Dakota, there was no sign. James checked the saddlebags with growing concern. The medical kit was gone, but had Dakota taken it? Or had Hammond's men found the horse and confiscated the supplies? A soft rustle from above made him look up. There, perched in the branches of a pine tree like some forest spirit, was Dakota. The boy's face split into a relieved grin at the sight of James. "I thought you were soldiers," Dakota explained as he climbed down, the precious medical kit clutched securely in one hand. "I hid when I heard someone coming." "Smart boy," James commended him. "Nara and the others are safe. They escaped the caves, but Nima needs that medicine urgently." Dakota's expression grew serious. "I found something else," he said, pointing to the west. "Soldiers, many horses, a camp." James followed the boy's gesture, squinting toward a distant ridgeline. There, barely visible, was a plume of smoke, too regular to be natural. "Hammond's base camp," James muttered. He came prepared for a long search. This complicated matters. Hammond clearly had more men than the 7 or 8 James had seen earlier. A proper military detachment, perhaps 15 or 20 soldiers in total, enough to establish a perimeter around the entire mountain if properly deployed. "We need to move quickly," James decided. "Help me gather whatever supplies are left in the saddlebags. Then we'll return to Nara and the children." As they worked, James formulated a plan. The trading post owned by Sam Turnbull was still their best hope, but it lay at least a day's journey to the west, directly past Hammond's camp. They would need to circle far to the south, adding precious hours to their journey, but avoiding direct confrontation. With the saddlebags emptied of everything useful, James untethered his mare. "We'll lead her," he told Dakota. "Too risky for both of us to ride." The boy nodded in understanding, and together they set off toward the hiding place where Nara waited with the children. The going was slow, both man and boy alert for any sign of Hammond's patrols. They found Nara and the children huddled in the depression James had described, a natural hollow screened by junipers and fallen logs. The younger children had fallen into exhausted sleep, but Nara remained vigilant, cradling Nima, whose breathing seemed more labored than before. James immediately knelt beside them, opening the medical kit. Inside were the basic supplies of a frontier doctor: quinine tablets, laudanum, bandages, a small bottle of alcohol, and various herbs and powders. He selected the quinine, breaking a tablet in half. "For the fever," he explained to Nara. "Crush it and mix with water. It's bitter, but it will help." Nara followed his instructions without question, her trust in him now complete. Dakota helped gather water from a nearby seep, using a tin cup from James's saddlebag. Together, they managed to get the medicine into Nima, who swallowed reflexively despite her semi-conscious state. "How long before we know if it works?" Nara asked, her voice tight with worry. "Hours, perhaps," James admitted, "but we can't wait here to find out. Hammond will expand his search once he realizes you've escaped the caves." He outlined his plan to circle south, then west toward Turnbull's trading post. Nara listened, her expression grave. "It is a long journey for the little ones," she observed. "And Nima—" "Uta, I'll carry her," James assured her, "and we'll use the horse for the youngest children, riding double or even triple if necessary." Nara translated his words to the children, who regarded James with a mixture of fear and hope. He realized that for most of them, he represented the enemy, a white man in a soldier's uniform who had brought nothing but suffering to their people. It would take time to earn their trust. As if reading his thoughts, Dakota stepped forward. He spoke to the other children in Apache, gesturing toward James with evident respect. Though James couldn't understand the words, The effect was clear. The children's expressions softened slightly, fear giving way to cautious acceptance. "What did he say?" James asked Nara. "That you are not a soldier anymore," she translated. "That you saved Kai, and now you will save all of us." James felt the weight of their expectations settle on his shoulders. "I'll try," he promised, meeting each child's gaze in turn. With Nima secured in a makeshift carrier on James's back, two of the youngest children seated on the mare, and the others prepared to walk. They set off. Nara took the lead, with Dakota bringing up the rear, his keen eyes watching for pursuit. Their progress was painfully slow. The children, already weakened by months of privation, struggled with the rough terrain. James found himself carrying first one exhausted child, then another, in addition to Nima. His legs burned with the effort, the blister on his foot a constant throbbing reminder of his own mortality. By midday, they had covered perhaps 3 miles, less than a third of the distance James had hoped for. They stopped in a small grove of aspens, the dancing leaves providing both shade and a natural alarm system that would rustle at the approach of intruders. James shared out the last of his provisions: jerky, dried fruit, and a handful of parched corn. It was woefully inadequate for 15 hungry souls, but it would have to suffice until they could reach Turnbull's trading post. As they rested, Nara checked on Nima. The girl's fever seemed slightly less intense, her breathing a bit easier. The quinine was working, but slowly. "She needs more," James said, examining the medical kit. "But we should wait a few hours before the next dose." Nara nodded, her hand gently stroking Nima's hair. "You have knowledge of healing." "Some," James acknowledged. "My wife taught me. She was skilled with herbs and remedies." He didn't add that her knowledge hadn't been enough to save her from the influenza that took her life. They resumed their journey after an hour's rest, pushing southward through increasingly rugged terrain. James's mare, accustomed to carrying a single rider, now bore 3 small children, alternating as their strength gave out. The loyal animal plodded on without complaint, picking her way carefully over the rocky ground. Late in the afternoon, they crossed a ridge that offered a clear view to the west. James paused, scanning the horizon. In the distance, perhaps 10 miles away, he could make out the faint outlines of buildings, Turnbull's trading post. "There," he said, pointing. "If we push hard, we might reach it by tomorrow noon." Nara followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. And then? It was a question James had been avoiding. What happened after they reached the trading post? Hammond would surely check there eventually. They needed a longer-term solution. "Turnbull has a cellar," James said slowly, "a hidden room where he sometimes shelters people who need to disappear for a while. We might stay there until Hammond gives up the search." "And if he does not give up?" Nara asked. James had no answer for that. Instead, he adjusted Nima's weight on his back and continued walking. One step at a time, 1 mile at a time. Problems beyond reaching safety would have to wait. As dusk approached, they found a suitable campsite in a small canyon, sheltered from view by high walls and dense vegetation. A tiny spring provided fresh water, and the natural alcoves in the rock face offered sleeping spaces for the children. James tended to his mare while Nara organized the children, assigning tasks with quiet efficiency. Despite their exhaustion, the older ones gathered wood for a small, smokeless fire, while others arranged sleeping areas using pine boughs for bedding. Dakota approached James as he finished rubbing down the horse. "I will take first watch," the boy offered in his careful English. James regarded him with respect. "You've done enough today. Rest now, I'll keep watch." Dakota shook his head stubbornly. "I know the sounds of the mountain. What belongs, what does not. You rest." There was wisdom in the boy's argument. James nodded, conceding the point. "Wake me in 4 hours then, and sooner if you hear anything unusual." With the camp settled and a small fire providing warmth against the mountain chill, James administered another half-tablet of quinine to Nima. The girl was more alert now, her eyes focusing on his face as he helped her drink. "Thank you," she whispered in English, surprising him. "You speak English well," James remarked gently. A small, feverish smile touched her lips. "Nara teaches us, says we must know the language of both worlds to survive." The simple statement struck James deeply. These children, hunted and homeless, were still learning, still preparing for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. He thought of Elizabeth and her belief in education as a bridge between cultures. She would have approved of Nara's efforts. As the night deepened and the children fell asleep, James found himself sitting beside Nara at the fire. They spoke quietly, their voices barely audible above the soft crackling of flames. "If we reach the trading post," Nara said, "what then? The reservation is not safe for us. They take children away from their families, cut their hair, forbid our language." "I know," James acknowledged. "The government calls it civilization, but it's nothing more than forced assimilation." Nara studied his face in the firelight. "You speak against your own government?" "I speak against injustice," James replied. "My government has broken every treaty it ever made with your people. That's not something I can defend or excuse." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Nara spoke again. "There are Apache bands in Mexico, far from American soldiers. If we could reach them—" James considered this. The Mexican border lay perhaps 100 miles south, a difficult journey but not impossible. But crossing that distance with 14 children, pursued by Hammond and his men, would be a monumental challenge. "One step at a time," he counseled. "First Turnbull's trading post. Then we'll consider what comes next." Nara nodded, accepting his practical approach. She gazed into the fire, her strong profile outlined against the darkness. "I have wondered," she said after a time, "why you paid those $3 for me. You could have simply walked away." James poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. "I've been walking away for 8 months," he said finally, "since Elizabeth died. Walking away from neighbors who needed help, from responsibilities, from life itself." He looked up, meeting Nara's gaze. "I was tired of walking away." It was the most honest answer he could give, and Nara seemed to recognize its truth. She reached out, briefly touching his hand in a gesture of understanding. "Sleep now," she said. "Tomorrow will demand all our strength." James settled himself on a bed of pine boughs, his body aching from the day's exertions. Despite his exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. His mind raced with plans and contingencies, calculating distances and dangers, trying to plot a path to safety for these children who had come to depend on him. When he finally thumped it off, his dreams were a confused tangle of past and present. Elizabeth reading to Apache children, while Hammond watched from the shadows. Nara leading a classroom while wearing his wife's dress. Dakota and Kai running through the halls of a house he had never built. He woke to Dakota's hand on his shoulder, the boy's expression tense in the dying firelight. "Horses," Dakota whispered, "coming this way." James was instantly alert. Years of military training asserting themselves. He moved silently to the edge of the canyon, listening intently. Dakota was right. The faint but unmistakable sound of horses moving slowly, deliberately, reached his ears. "How many?" he whispered. Dakota held up 4 fingers, then pointed west and north, indicating the rider's direction of approach. James nodded, his mind racing through options. They could attempt to flee, but in darkness, with exhausted children, they wouldn't get far. They could hide deeper in the canyon, but if Hammond's men were tracking them, that would only delay the inevitable. That left confrontation, a prospect James had hoped to avoid, but perhaps it could be managed on his terms, away from the children. "Wake Nara," he instructed Dakota. "Tell her to keep the children quiet and hidden. I'm going to draw them away." Dakota's eyes widened in alarm, but he nodded, understanding the necessity of James's plan. As the boy slipped back to camp, James checked his rifle, confirming it was loaded and ready. He had 5 rounds in the chamber and another dozen in his pocket, not enough for a prolonged engagement, but sufficient for what he had in mind. Moving with deliberate stealth, James worked his way up the canyon wall, finding a position on the rim that overlooked the approaching riders. From here, he could see them clearly in the moonlight. 4 men on horseback, moving in a search pattern consistent with military training. Hammond wasn't with them, but James recognized Sergeant Ellis at the lead. James waited until they were within 100 yards of the canyon entrance, then fired a single shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed across the landscape, causing the horses to rear in surprise. The soldiers immediately took defensive positions, rifles ready. "That's far enough, Ellis," James called down, keeping his voice even. Blackwood? Ellis's voice carried clearly in the night air. Hammond said you might be out here. Said you've gone renegade. I haven't gone anything, James replied. I'm just helping some children reach safety. Ellis laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Safety? With Apache? The only safe Apache is on the reservation or in the ground. These are children, Ellis. The oldest is 12. They grow up to be warriors, Ellis countered. Colonel Hammond has his orders. All hostiles are to be rounded up and returned to the reservation. James shifted positions slightly, wanting to maintain the illusion that he was alone. Since when are starving children considered hostiles? Since they're harbored by a woman who killed 2 soldiers, Ellis replied. You know the law, Blackwood. I know justice, James countered, and there's none in hunting children across mountains because a commanding officer needs a victory to restore his reputation. He could see Ellis conferring with his men, their voices too low to hear. After a moment, Ellis called up again. Hammond's offering terms. Surrender the woman and children, and you can go free. No charges, no questions. James almost laughed at the transparent deception. And I'm supposed to believe that? You have my word as a soldier, Ellis insisted. I had Hammond's word once too, James replied bitterly. It wasn't worth the air it took to speak it. Ellis's patience visibly thinned. Don't be a fool, Blackwood. We have 20 men combing these mountains. You can't escape, and you can't win against those odds. I don't need to win, James said calmly. I just need to keep you talking long enough. Even from a distance, James could see Ellis's confusion turn to alarm as he realized the implication. The sergeant wheeled his horse around, scanning the darkness beyond the canyon. It's a diversion. Hi, Ellis shouted to his men. The Apache are escaping while he keeps us here. Exactly as James had hoped, Ellis led his men in a charge away from the canyon, convinced that Nara and the children were fleeing in the opposite direction. James waited until they were well out of sight before making his way quickly back down to the camp. He found Nara already organizing the children for immediate departure, her efficiency impressive in the face of crisis. They'll realize their mistakes soon enough, James warned as he helped secure Nima on his back. We need to be well away from here before they return. Nara nodded, her expression resolute. We go west now? To the trading post? James considered their options. Ellis and his men were likely heading east, expecting to intercept escapees. That might actually make the western route temporarily safer. Yes, he decided, directly west. If we push through the night, we can reach Turnbull's by dawn. They moved out in silence, the children understanding the gravity of their situation. Even the youngest made no complaint as they trudged through the darkness, guided by Nara's uncanny ability to find a path where James saw only obstacles. The night wore on, each hour a test of endurance. Twice they stopped to rest, but only briefly, the constant threat of pursuit driving them forward. Nima's fever had broken, her small body limp against James's back, exhausted but no longer burning with infection. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, James called another halt. They had reached a vantage point that offered a clear view of the terrain ahead. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, stood Turnbull's trading post, a cluster of low buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade. We made it, Dakota breathed, relief evident in his voice. Not yet, James cautioned, studying the landscape with experience in eyes. Something's wrong. Even from this distance, he could see that the trading post was unusually active for such an early hour. Horses were tethered outside, too many for Turnbull's normal business, and the gate stood open, with men moving in and out in a pattern that suggested a military presence. Hammond? Nara guessed, following James's gaze. James nodded grimly. He's anticipated us, probably has men watching the post. Their situation had suddenly become dire. Behind them, Ellis and his patrol were likely already aware of their deception and returning to the canyon. Ahead lay Hammond and what appeared to be a significant force. With exhausted children and dwindling supplies, they had neither the strength to fight nor the resources to flee. What do we do now? Dakota asked, his young voice steady despite the fear James could see in his eyes. James considered their options, few as they were. They could try to circle around the trading post, but that would mean at least another day's journey without supplies or shelter. They could attempt to reach another settlement, but the nearest was 30 miles away, an impossible distance under current circumstances. Or they could confront Hammond directly, a prospect that seemed suicidal but might offer their only chance for resolution. I'm going to the trading post, James decided. Alone. Nara's expression hardened. No, they will arrest you, or worse. Maybe, James acknowledged, but Hammond wants you and the children. If I can convince him that you've escaped south toward Mexico, he might pull his men from here to pursue you. A diversion, Dakota said, understanding immediately. Like before. Yes, James confirmed, but this time, I'll be the diversion. You and Nara will take the children north, to that ridge. He pointed to a heavily wooded hillside about a mile away. Wait there until dark. If I don't return by then, continue east to the McAllister Ranch. Kate McAllister is a friend. She'll help you. Nara shook her head, unwilling to accept his plan. You cannot face Hammond alone. He has too many men. I don't intend to fight him, James explained, just to mislead him. Hammond's hatred for me will make him believe whatever story serves his purpose. Still, Nara hesitated, clearly torn between the need to protect the children and her reluctance to abandon James to what seemed like certain capture or death. There must be another way, she insisted. James looked at the exhausted children, at Nima still weak from fever, at the empty saddlebags that had once held their meager provisions. If there is, I don't see it. The children need food, shelter. They can't run anymore. Dakota spoke up unexpectedly. I will go with you. James turned to the boy in surprise. No, Dakota, it's too dangerous. Two stories are more believable than one, Dakota argued with a logic beyond his years. If we both say Nara took the children south, Hammond will believe. James had to admit there was wisdom in the boy's suggestion. Hammond would be more likely to accept information from an Apache child who might be coerced or frightened into revealing the truth. Nara, however, was adamant. No, I will not risk Dakota. It is my choice, the boy countered in Apache, the words unintelligible to James but the determination in his voice clear enough. A rapid exchange followed, with Dakota arguing his case and Nara reluctantly conceding points. James waited, understanding that this was a decision they needed to reach themselves. Finally, Nara turned to him, her expression grave. Dakota will go with you, but you must swear to protect him with your life. I swear it, James promised, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. No harm will come to him while I draw breath. The plan settled, they quickly made final arrangements. James transferred Nima to Nara's care, giving her the last of the quinine tablets. Dakota said his goodbyes to the other children, his young face solemn but determined. Remember, James told Nara, the ridge until nightfall, then east to McAllister's if we don't return. Nara nodded, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture that conveyed more than words could express. Then she was moving, herding the children northward toward the relative safety of the wooded ridge, while James and Dakota turned west, toward Turnbull's trading post and whatever awaited them there. They approached openly, making no attempt at concealment. James had discarded his rifle, keeping only his sidearm, not wanting to appear overtly hostile. Dakota walked beside him, matching his stride despite the boy's shorter legs, his back straight with a dignity that belied his 12 years. When they were within 100 yards of the trading post, the consequences of their bold approach became apparent. 4 soldiers emerged from behind the palisade, rifles raised, while others took positions along the wall, creating a formidable reception. That's far enough, Blackwood, called a familiar voice. Colonel Hammond stepped through the gate, his uniform immaculate despite the early hour, his gray mustache nearly trimmed above a cold smile. I've been expecting you. James halted, raising his hand slightly to indicate peaceful intentions. I'd like to speak with Sam Turnbull, he replied evenly. Mr. Turnbull is indisposed at the moment, Hammond said with false courtesy, but I'm more than happy to receive your surrender. I'm not here to surrender, Colonel, James replied. I'm here to negotiate. Hammond's eyebrows rose slightly. Negotiate? With a renegade harboring Apache fugitives? I think not. His gaze shifted to Dakota. Though I see you've brought a peace offering. James felt Dakota tense beside him, but was impressed when the boy remained outwardly calm. This young man has agreed to help resolve this situation peacefully, James explained. He has information you want. James spent 3 days confined to a storeroom at the back of Turnbull's trading post, guarded by Hammond's men. He was treated correctly, if not comfortably, given regular meals and water, but no information about events outside his improvised cell. Of Dakota, he saw nothing, though one sympathetic young soldier assured him the boy was being well treated, given free run of the trading post under supervision. On the morning of the fourth day, the door to his cell opened to reveal not a guard with his breakfast, but Colonel Hammond himself, his expression unreadable. "Well, Blackwood," Hammond began without preamble, "it seems your Apache woman is indeed heading south. My patrols found tracks of a large group crossing the San Pedro River, consistent with your story." James kept his expression neutral, hiding his relief. If Hammond's men were searching that far south, it meant Nara and the children had likely reached the McAllister Ranch safely. "The tracks must belong to some other group, a fortunate coincidence." "Then our agreement stands?" James asked. Hammond nodded reluctantly. "The boy goes free, and you—" He hesitated, something almost like discomfort crossing his features. "There's been a development regarding your situation." Before James could question this cryptic statement, a new figure appeared in the doorway behind Hammond. Sam Turnbull, the trading post's owner. The normally robust man looked haggard, with a bandage around his head, but his expression brightened at the sight of James. "Blackwood, thank God you're alive," Turnbull exclaimed, pushing past Hammond to clasp James's hand. "When these soldiers arrived making accusations, I feared the worst." "I'm fine, Sam," James assured him, though his confusion was evident. "What happened to your head?" Turnbull grimaced. "Had a disagreement with the butt of a rifle when I objected to my establishment being commandeered." He shot Hammond a reproachful look. "But that's of no matter now. The important thing is the charges against you have been dropped." James stared in disbelief, first at Turnbull, then at Hammond, whose expressions suggested he'd been forced to swallow something extremely unpleasant. "Dropped? On whose authority?" "Mine," came a new voice from the doorway. A tall, distinguished man in a general's uniform stepped into the already crowded room. "General George Crook, at your service, Mr. Blackwood." James recognized the name immediately. Crook was the department commander, responsible for all military operations in the Arizona Territory, and known for his relatively fair treatment of the Apache compared to his predecessors. "General," James acknowledged, still struggling to understand this sudden reversal of fortune. "I received some interesting communications regarding Colonel Hammond's activities here," Crook explained, fixing Hammond with a stern gaze. "Reports of resources being diverted from essential patrols to pursue, and I quote, a band of dangerous Apache renegades that turned out to be orphaned children." Hammond's face flushed with anger, but he remained silent under his superior scrutiny. "Additionally," Crook continued, "I received sworn testimony from a Miss Catherine McAllister regarding the attempted assault on a female Apache prisoner by soldiers under Hammond's command, confirming your account of events." Kate McAllister. James felt a surge of gratitude toward his old friend. She had clearly done more than shelter Nara and the children. She had advocated for them to the highest authority in the territory. "There's one more thing you should know," General Crook added, his tone softening. "A young private named Thomas Wilson has come forward. He was under Hammond's command during the incident at the missionary outpost." James felt his heart constrict. "What about him?" "He's admitted to firing the shot that killed your daughter, Mr. Blackwood. Says he was a frightened recruit following orders, but the guilt has been eating at him. He provided a sworn statement contradicting Hammond's official report about Apache attackers." Crook paused, watching James carefully. "He's requested to speak with you, if you are willing." James stood perfectly still, a storm of emotions battling within him. The face of his daughter's killer, a nameless specter that had haunted his dreams for months, suddenly had a name, a story. "I don't know if I can," he admitted hoarsely. "The boy is barely 20, Crook said quietly, "carrying a burden almost as heavy as yours." "Where is he now?" "Outside with Dakota. He insisted on accompanying us, even knowing you might refuse to see him. Said he owed it to your daughter to help protect the children she cared about." James closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. "I'll see him. Not today, but soon." Elizabeth would have wanted that, he realized. She had always believed in redemption. "In light of these circumstances," Crook concluded, "I've ordered all charges against you dismissed. Colonel Hammond will be returning to Fort Whipple for reassignment, effective immediately." Hammond's expression was thunderous, but the presence of a superior officer kept him from voicing the rage clearly visible in his eyes. With a stiff salute to Crook and a final glare at James, he turned and left the room. "Thank you, General," James said sincerely. "But what about the boy at Dakota, and Nara and the other children?" Hammond promised the boy would go free. "The boy is fine," Crook assured him. "He's outside with my adjutant, quite impatient to see you." The general's expression softened slightly. "As for the woman and the other children, they're safe at the McAllister Ranch for the moment. Their future, however, remains uncertain." Turnbull cleared his throat. "That's the other reason for our visit, James. The general has a proposition for you." Crook nodded, his keen eyes assessing James thoughtfully. "I understand you own a substantial property near the northern border?" 160 acres, James confirmed, "though I haven't done much with it since my daughter died." "Perhaps it's time you did," Crook suggested. "I'm instituting a new policy regarding displaced Apache who cannot or will not go to the reservations. In certain cases, where appropriate guardianship can be established, they may be permitted to settle on private land, provided they remain peaceful and self-sufficient." James began to understand the direction of the conversation. "And Nara and the children would qualify for this arrangement?" "Under your guardianship, yes," Crook confirmed. "It would require commitment on your part, Mr. Blackwood. These children need education, stability. The woman, Nara, would need legal protection that only your status as their guardian could provide." The implications were enormous. James would effectively become responsible for 14 Apache children and a woman he had known for less than a week. And yet, he found himself considering the proposition with unexpected seriousness. "I would need help," he said slowly. "Supplies, tools. The ranch has been neglected." Turnbull grinned. "That's where I come in. The general has authorized me to provide whatever you need on the Army's account, as reparation for the, inconvenience caused by Colonel Hammond." "Consider it an investment in a more peaceful territory," Crook added pragmatically. "Every child raised to understand both Apache and white ways is one less potential warrior in future conflicts." James recognized the political calculation behind Crook's generosity, but he also sensed a genuine concern for the children's welfare. The general was known for his unusual approach to Indian affairs, preferring negotiation to force when possible. "I accept," James said finally, "but I want your written authorization for this arrangement, something that will stand even if you're transferred or replaced." Crook smiled slightly. "Already prepared, Mr. Blackwood. My adjutant has the papers ready for your signature." Events moved quickly after that. James was released, reunited with a jubilant Dakota, and provided with fresh clothing and supplies. By midday, they were on horseback, heading east toward the McAllister Ranch, accompanied by Turnbull and a small escort of Crook's men. The reunion at the McAllister Ranch was emotional beyond anything James had anticipated. The children swarmed around Dakota, chattering excitedly in Apache, while Kate McAllister, a formidable widow who ran her late husband's cattle operation with impressive efficiency, greeted James with a warm embrace. "You look like hell, James Blackwood," she observed bluntly, "but considerably better than when I last saw you. There's life in your eyes again." James couldn't deny it. The crushing weight of grief that had defined his existence since Elizabeth's death had lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose he had thought lost forever. And then Nara was there, standing slightly apart, watching him with an expression that combined relief, gratitude, and something more complex that he couldn't quite define. They regarded each other for a long moment, words seemingly inadequate for all that had transpired between them. Finally, James simply said, "We're going home, all of us." Nara's composure broke, tears filling her eyes. "Home," she repeated, as if testing the unfamiliar concept. "For the children? This is certain?" James handed her the official document bearing General Crook's signature and seal. "As certain as anything can be in this territory." She studied the paper, though James suspected she could read little of it. "What does this mean? In simple words?" "It means the children can live freely on my land," James explained. "They'll need to learn English and some of our ways, but they can also keep their language, their traditions." He paused, meeting her gaze directly. "And you will have legal protection as their caretaker. No one can take you or them away without due process of law." Nara handed the document back, her expression solemn. And what is your role in this arrangement? Guardian, legally speaking, James replied. In practice, whatever is needed. Teacher, farmer, protector. He smiled slightly. I suspect I'll be learning as much from all of you as you learn from me. The journey north to James's ranch took 5 days, the pace deliberately unhurried to accommodate the children's strength. Turnbull accompanied them with a wagon loaded with supplies, tools, seed, material for clothing, books, and provisions to last until they could establish their own crops and livestock. James was surprised to find his property in better condition than expected. Neighbors had maintained the basic structures in his absence, though the fields lay fallow and the cattle had been sold off to pay for Elizabeth's burial and his own subsistence during the months of grief that followed. The main house, a solid structure of logs and adobe, needed repairs but was fundamentally sound. The barn could shelter animals once they acquired them. A clear stream provided water year-round. It wasn't paradise, but it was a beginning. The children approached the unfamiliar surroundings with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Under Nara's guidance, they quickly established their own routines, helping to clean the house, clear fields, and plant the first crops in what would become their shared home. James found himself busier than he had been in years, rising before dawn and working until dusk. There were fences to mend, a roof to repair, furniture to build for the growing household. But the work felt purposeful, meaningful in a way that nothing had since Elizabeth's death. One evening, about 2 weeks after their arrival, James sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and gold. Nara joined him, offering a cup of coffee, which he accepted gratefully. The children are settling well, she observed, taking a seat beside him. They're remarkably resilient, James agreed. Even Nima is gaining strength daily. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, the cooling evening air carrying the scent of pine from the nearby forest. In the distance, they could hear the children's voices as Dakota led them in some game involving much laughter and running. I have been thinking, Nara said finally, about those $3. James glanced at her, curious. What about them? When you paid them, I was angry. I thought you were buying me like property. Her gaze remained on the sunset as she spoke. Now I understand you were not buying my life that day. You were giving me the chance to choose it. The insight struck James deeply. I never thought of it that way, but yes, I suppose that's true. Nara turned to face him. Freedom is not dying to prove you cannot be owned. It is living because you finally can. James considered her words, finding wisdom in them that applied to his own journey as much as to hers. For months after Elizabeth's death, he had been merely existing, a ghost in his own life. Now, through helping Nara and the children, he had found purpose again, a reason to truly live. There's something I've been meaning to show you, he said, rising from his chair. Come with me. He led her to a small room at the back of the house that had remained closed since their arrival. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with books of every description. A desk stood beneath the window, and a blackboard hung on one wall. Elizabeth's books, James explained. She was collecting them for a lending library she wanted to start for children who couldn't afford their own. She never got the chance to use them. Nara moved slowly around the room, her fingers brushing reverently over the book spines. And now? Now they're yours, James said simply. Yours and the children's. Elizabeth would have wanted that. Nara turned to him, emotion evident in her usually composed features. We will honor her memory in how we use them. As they prepared to leave the room, Sam Turnbull's voice called from the doorway. Almost forgot to give you this. He handed James a folded newspaper. Just came in from Washington. James unfolded the paper, scanning the headline. Congressional Inquiry into Indian Affairs. New Policy Questioned. The article detailed congressional concerns about General Crook's lenient approach to Apache management and hinted at possible policy revisions when the new Secretary of the Interior took office next month. Might be nothing, Turnbull said, watching James's face, but thought you should know. Politicians have short memories when it comes to promises made to Indians. James folded the paper carefully. Thank you, Sam. I'll keep it in mind. After Turnbull left, Nara gestured to the newspaper. Bad news? Potentially, James admitted. Washington politics. The agreement we have with Crook might not be as secure as we'd hoped. Nara's expression hardened with determination. Then we will make this place so strong, so valuable, that even Washington will see its worth. And if they don't, James asked, then we will fight, not with weapons, but with words, with these. She touched the spines of Elizabeth's books. The children will learn both worlds so well that no one can deny them their place in either. James nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her strategy. We'll need allies. Kate McAllister, Turnbull, perhaps even that young soldier, Thomas Wilson. And General Crook, Nara added. Yes, we'll build something here that's too important to destroy with the stroke of a pen in Washington. A new sense of purpose filled him. The fight wasn't over, perhaps it never would be, but they would face it together. In that moment, standing amidst his daughter's legacy, James felt a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. The journey that had begun with $3 paid at an auction had led here to a new beginning for all of them. Outside, the sun's last rays gilded the landscape, and the children's laughter floated on the evening air like a promise of better days to come. Not an ending, James thought, but a beginning. A freedom purchased for $3, but worth infinitely more. 15 years passed, bringing changes that none of them could have imagined on that first evening. The small homestead had grown into a thriving community, with additional cabins built to accommodate the children as they grew into adulthood. Some had left to make their own way in the world, but many had stayed, helping to expand the farm and establish a small school that served both Apache children and those from nearby settlements. Dakota, now 27, had fulfilled the promise James had seen in him as a boy. After studying at a progressive school back east, arranged through General Crook's connections, he had returned to become the first Apache teacher officially recognized by the Arizona Territorial Government. His classroom combined traditional Apache knowledge with Western education, just as Elizabeth would have wanted. Nima, the fragile child who had nearly died from lung fever, had grown into a strong young woman of 21. Her early brush with death had inspired her to learn the healing arts, first from Nara's traditional knowledge, then through formal training with a doctor in Prescott who had recognized her natural aptitude. Now she served as a nurse, moving between communities and bridging two medical traditions. James, his hair now completely white at 67, sat in a rocking chair on the porch of the main house, watching the afternoon activities with quiet satisfaction. The weight of grief that had once threatened to crush him had long since transformed into something else, not forgotten, but incorporated into the tapestry of a life that had found purpose again. Nara emerged from the house, carrying 2 cups of coffee. At 45, her face showed the lines of hardship and laughter in equal measure. The warrior markings were long gone, but the strength and dignity remained, tempered now with a peace that had been hard-won. The new family arrives tomorrow, she said, handing James his cup. The Garcias, 3 children. James nodded. Dakota says the oldest boy has a gift for mathematics, and the youngest girl is already speaking 3 languages, Nara added with a smile. They will fit in well here. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as children played in the meadow beyond the house. Apache, Mexican, white, all mixed together in games that required no translation. I've been thinking, Nara said after a while. A dangerous pastime, James teased, a familiar exchange between them. About those $3, she continued, ignoring his jest. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been in that auction yard that day? James considered the question seriously. Sometimes, but then I look at all this. He gestured toward the school, the children, the thriving crops, and I think it might be the best $3 anyone ever spent. Nara reached over and took his hand, a gesture that had become natural over the years. You know, you never actually bought my freedom that day. No? No, she said firmly. Freedom isn't something that can be purchased. What you bought was the chance for me to choose freedom. There's a difference. James nodded, understanding the distinction. Freedom isn't the absence of chains. It's the presence of choice, Nara finished. And look at all the choices we've made since then. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, James reflected that true freedom, like true healing, wasn't found in dramatic moments, but in the thousands of small choices that followed. Choices to trust, to build, to forgive, to persevere. $3 for a lifetime of choices, he murmured. A bargain at twice the price. Nara's laughter, warm and genuine, joined the sounds of children's voices carrying on the evening breeze, the soundtrack of a freedom that had proven to be priceless.